is when you do any kind of mixing, whether you're doing actual output, say a coin join, or whether you're doing ring signatures, if you know the transaction amount, then that complicates that enormously.
Of course.
Because you can only mix in denominations.
Mm-hmm.
And then what happens is it creates a humongous opportunity for doing correlation analysis.
Mm-hmm.
With hiding the transaction amount, it makes ring signatures just orders of magnitude more effective. Because now what happens is some guy can have 1,000 Monero, and the next guy can have 0.02 Monero, the next guy can put 0.001. You mix the three, and you don't know which is which.
This episode is sponsored by Nordvpn. I've been using Nordvpn for years since it doesn't log your data, has over 5,300 super fast servers in 59 countries, and I can pay in my favorite cryptocurrency, Dash, which is important since I'm unbanked. Take back your online privacy. Sign up now with the promo code DCN and get 68% off, or just $3.71 per month, plus an additional month free. Go to nordvpn.org/DCN or use the coupon code DCN. Hey everyone, I have the wonderful pleasure of speaking with the one and only ArticMine, or Francisco Cabañas, of the Monero core team. How's it going, man?
I'm doing really good, and it's a pleasure to be on the broadcast.
Yes, well, thanks very much for taking the time to chat with me. So, over the last few weeks, I guess, I've been kind of doing an interview series exploring the concept of privacy in cryptocurrency, because I think this is an area that most people don't really understand much about. I think that most normies who don't know much about cryptocurrency at all assume everything is like Bitcoin is super anonymous. That's what they think. And most cryptocurrency users probably think that if it's called a privacy coin, by any kind of publication, that means it's super anonymous. Everything else is not. And it seems like there's this lack of understanding. And so I've been trying to get a lot of interviews about this kind of thing with people who actually know what they're talking about. And so who better to talk to than you on this, right?
Yes, I could definitely speak on the subject. And I definitely disagree with the separation so drastic that you described, by the way.
Yes, of course. And they're, in my view, separations based in misconceptions.
That is correct.
Yes. So first, if you wouldn't mind, can you give a basic description of how Monero's privacy works today, and then we can kind of mention how it might have worked in the past? So, yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so the first thing I have to say about Monero's privacy, and this is really important to understand, is that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts.
Mm-hmm.
And this, I'll come back to this element. But essentially what Monero does is you have three things. You hide the transaction amount. That's called confidential transactions. You mix the signatures that you use to sign a transaction. So you're not mixing the coins, you're mixing the signatures. Mm-hmm. So you have 1 out of 11 possible sets of signatures to sign the coin. That's called ring signatures. Mm-hmm. And then you have stealth addresses, which basically when you send Monero to an address, that is not shown on the blockchain. You see a transaction output. Mm-hmm. And you can't derive one from the other unless you have the knowledge, unless you're one of the parties in the transaction, either who receives or sends as the transaction. Most recently, the third thing that's been added is Dandelion++, which people are familiar with Bitcoin. That's actually on that chain, or was proposed there, which hides the sender IP address. It's from making it so obvious. So you end up broadcasting from a different node than the one that originally sent the transaction.
Yeah.
So that's the essence in a very short description of what it is. So if you think of, for example, ring signatures, it's a way of mixing who actually signed the output. Mm-hmm. Now, where it gets really interesting, and if you're looking, for example, at transactional analysis and so on, is when you do any kind of mixing, whether you're doing actual output, say a coin join, or whether you're doing ring signatures, if you know the transaction amount, then that complicates that enormously.
Of course.
Because you can only mix in denominations. Mm-hmm. And then what happens is it creates a humongous opportunity for doing correlation analysis.
Mm-hmm.
With hiding the transaction amount, it makes ring signatures just orders of magnitude more effective. Because now what happens is some guy could have 1,000 Monero, and the next guy could have 0.02 Monero, the next guy could put 0.001. You mix the three, and you don't know which is which. Mm-hmm. So you're hiding without even having to know amounts. So this is incredibly important. So this is why I say the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, because the minute you hide the transaction amount, then what happens is ring confidential transactions, ring signatures become way more effective as a result. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of in a nutshell, the simplest sort of nutshell I can give you of how Monero privacy works. Now, one of the impacts of this, this is interesting, is when you transact in Monero, let's say I buy a cup of coffee, like I get I'm a contractor, I'm being paid in Monero, I go buy a cup of coffee. I've just run a mix. Mm-hmm. Because what's happening is I take my income from that contractor, I go to a coffee shop, I pay with Monero, I've churned the output. So now there's an automatic mixing every time you transact. Mm-hmm. And because Monero's privacy is mandatory, you can't transact without doing the mixing. Then what happens is every time you transact, you actually are running a mixing operation, effectively.
Yeah.
And so other people are also taking your outputs, and they're doing the same thing. So because it's sitting in the chain, the algorithm picks your output, and it gets mixed in somebody else's transaction. So this is happening all the time. So the more you use it as a transactional currency, the more private it becomes, actually.
Yeah.
And that's one of the characteristics. The other key element of Monero's privacy is that you do have what's called a view key, and that's the capability to provide a trusted auditor, for example, access to your wallet information without giving them spend access. Mm-hmm. And this is important, for example, in an audit situation, or so you do have the option to opt out of privacy if you choose to by providing a view key.
Yeah. That makes sense.
And that's an element in Monero, and the person has the view key, and you need the transaction images to get, which is that person then has actually access to the transaction throughput, and that's well known. So that's kind of the overview, very simplistic overview of how it works.
Yeah.
At its most basic level.
And now I've been sort of paying attention to the space for a while, and of course anything takes years to learn and stuff, obviously focuses in the longer you're in. I remember in the early days seeing some changes happen to the way Monero worked to make it a lot better. So for example, I remember when there was a no mix-in requirement for transactions, and then it turned into then you have to have stuff. I believe was it 4 mix-ins today? I haven't paid attention.
It was the initial specification. Effectively, you got to pick any mixing that you want. So you could do 0 or 1, which effectively didn't give you a mixing. Mm-hmm. So you had effectively opt-in privacy. Then it was recommended to have a mixing of 3. So the next one was 3. Then it was raised to 5. Mm-hmm. Then it was raised to 7. And the most recent was raised to 11. Mm. The difference is that these were mandatory mixings. The latest one at 11, it actually is what you have to use. There's no choice on the level of mixing that you do. If you want further mixing, what you have to do essentially is churn, which is, like I said, just buy a cup of coffee with it. Mm-hmm. Effectively, it gives you that extra mixing if you want to do that.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's actually a good... Sorry.
So I remember that part. And then also I remember at one point the proof size, it ended up taking so much data that it would take a lot of... transaction fees are relatively high. And then bulletproofs got implemented, and then pretty much overnight the fees went like way, way, way down. And
that's correct.
Even today, so from what the blockchain analysis could tell, which it was obviously not everything, it was until recently between like 1 and 2 cents for an average transaction fee. Obviously, you can't tell the median because you don't have access to that data. And about today, it's like 3 or 4 cents average.
The averages I think are a bit Probably the best site that'll give you the information is this one site, some of the blockchain sites that should give you the raw data. It's actually can be less than a cent to send a transaction. Because all it takes is one person picking a really high fee, and it throws the average off.
And that's how averages work, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's the nature. That's the nature of it. The two things that occurred that were fundamentally very interesting, and I'll go. First of all, historically, Monero did not have confidential transactions. This was added in. The work was done in 2016, and it went on the main chain right at the beginning of 2017. And so what happened at that point in time is the transaction size went to 13.5 kilobytes. I'm talking for a 2 input, 2 output transaction. And Monero has a really interesting scaling algorithm, which is really unique. And it's got nothing to do with privacy, by the way. But we could discuss it at a later point. But the impact of this, is, of course, is that the fees went up, but also the transaction size was very large. Bulletproofs comes in, and then all of a sudden, we kept the block size, the minimum block size for scaling the same. So now the transaction size drops by a factor of 5. And because of how the scaling formula works, the fee went down by a factor of 25. So we went from 13.5 kilobyte transactions for 2 in, 2 out to about 2,600. And now the next hard fork that is coming in 2 weeks, basically, October 17th, there's going to be a further reduction to about 2,000 bytes.
Nice. That's pretty low.
So roughly about 5 times what you'll see for a Bitcoin transaction. So that's the number. And this is why we see this big drop in block sizes, but also this big drop in fees. And so you had this period of time between basically 2017 until about September, October 2018, where the fees were high and the transaction sizes were about 30.5 kilobytes.
Yeah, so it's funny because we're talking about all these amazing improvements that basically allow a very solidly private thing to scale to, let a lot of people use it. And yet, while we're still talking about that, we're mentioning a 5 times larger than Bitcoin transaction size. And what are the scaling limits of Monero? So what we can think of, and this is an interesting question because already we see Bitcoin, and there's arguments whether it's a political / arbitrary limit that it has, but we're seeing a lot of like on-chain coins have scaling problems, and then you have something that's say like 5 times the size, but again, variable block size comes into that too. But so realistically, how many users can Monero field, or is it expected or hoped to field, in the long term, let's say 5 to 10 years?
Okay, let me backtrack on this because this is a really critical question. First of all, and this shocks people in the Monero community, the reason I got involved with Monero was scaling and not privacy.
Interesting.
And I have to say this when I do interviews because people are like, what? And I explain in a second why. I was involved as an early Bitcoin adopter. I started with Bitcoin in 2011, buying, a Bitcoin for $5 Canadian, $5 and $3 and all this. It was quite interesting. And I approached it from the way any investor would approach it. And I said, okay, how can it fail? And I spent a lot of time studying Bitcoin and studying the scaling debate. And I recognized this is the Achilles heel. The Achilles heel of Bitcoin is scaling.
Yeah.
I posted in the original thread that was started 10 years ago in response when Satoshi introduced the 1 megabyte block limit. My 1 megabyte block limit in Bitcoin was introduced in August of 2010. It was not in the original protocol. And this discussion, that was the birth of the block size debate in Bitcoin. It's basically 10 years old right now. Now, at the heart of the problem is a little phrase in the Satoshi white paper that says that transaction fees can replace block rewards. There's no justification from this. And I will criticize, one thing I criticize about Satoshi's work is that one phrase. The fact that you make a statement in what is otherwise a work of genius does not make the statement true. You can create a work of genius and you put a false statement in the middle of it.
Yeah, of course.
And that's essentially what this is. So the fundamental problem that you have in Bitcoin is that in order to eventually replace the falling block reward with transaction fees, you have to somehow restrict the block size to cause the fees to go up so that you can effectively replace the block rewards. What Monero did to deal with this problem right at the get-go was to say, no, we're going to put a minimum tail emission. We'll call it a tail emission or a minimum emission. And the equivalent is 0.6 Monero every 2 minutes per block. It's a 5-minute block. If you do a rough comparison with, say, Bitcoin, that's equivalent to about 3.125 Bitcoins per block on a 10-minute block. That stays there. So there's no worry that this thing is going to go to zero. And then what happens is really interesting. The minute you do that, then Nielsen's law comes into the picture. And just to give you an idea of what I'm talking about here, whilst the Bitcoin debate has gone on, 1 megabyte in 2010, as far as bandwidth is concerned, I'm talking Nielsen's law, is roughly equivalent to 57 megabytes today.
Yeah.
Over a 10-year period. Now, you go another 10-year period, you want to multiply that, square it. You're talking about 3 gigabytes, roughly. This is what we're talking about. Now, this is where I'm a baby boomer. I was born in 1957. I have seen technological change. I was given by a friend of mine a 286 20 years ago that I'm restoring. It has a 10 megabyte hard drive.
Yes, I've used things like that in the past before. My father was a programmer in the punch card days, so I remember that.
Okay, so you remember what I'm talking about.
Yes.
I even, as a recent graduated in physics and mathematics at the University of British Columbia, in 1979, I wrote a program to solve differential equations on the university mainframe. And I got an error because I asked for 2 megabytes of RAM. That was the maximum capacity of the university mainframe in 1979.
Yeah, and that's very small by today's standards.
Exactly. So when people talk about scaling, the limit, is it a protocol limit? And this is where I'm getting by, it's important. Or are we talking about technology? Technology is going to take care of scaling. The question is, will the protocol handle it? And a fivefold isn't an issue. Quite apart from the fact that there's also a fair amount of mixing going on and transactions for privacy reasons in a coin like Bitcoin, coin joins, and that kind of thing that could also increase block sizes. So a fivefold increase in transaction size is nothing. The question is, can the protocol support the technological change? Now, my other favorite example is the credit card industry. Now, credit cards were first conceived in 1949 with the Diners Club. And they kind of started coming out in the late 1950s and 1960s, and only really started becoming mainstream into the late 70s, 80s. We're not even talking debit at this point. And the same problem. How do you process credit card transactions with telegraph lines, tabulating machines, and punch cards? Well, that's how they did it in 1950. It was an expensive process. And one of the reasons, the protocol issues with why the price hasn't gone down for credit card transactions, but what made centralized ledger transactions possible is the fact that you have this humongous, it's 10 to the 12, 10 to the 14, lower cost of data processing, the CPU power, storage, bandwidth. Comparing a fiber optic line with a telegraph line that you don't even have into your home. You have to actually go to a telegraph office to send them a message. And I'm old enough to remember that in the 1960s. So this is kind of what I'm talking about. So when people talk about scaling, technology solves the problem. The real question in my mind is, will the protocol support it? And that's where Monero. So the answer to your question, yeah, the limit is basically technological. There's no protocol limit in how big Monero blocks can grow. They are limited on how fast they can grow, but there are no limits on how big they can grow.
Yeah, so let's just say a hypothetical where people start to realize that fiat currencies are inflating a lot. They start to get scared, where most people in the first world are not scared. They think their money is going to be relatively valuable for a while. If people get scared and they say, oh, they all run to Bitcoin because they want something that they can use that's not, that is scarce. But then they realize that they have problems actually using it. And then say there's a big incident that happens with privacy where they get tracked down, or there's some, someone finds someone's, someone has a lot of money, go to their house and there's some violence, and then they get scared and they say, okay, well, we need something that can scale and be private. And so everyone decides to use Monero. Like, say you have 200 million people using Monero all of a sudden in the next 5 years. Would it be realistic in that time frame for them all to be able to basically send a couple payments every day each for a reasonable price?
I would say so, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, basically what would happen is you would have the enthusiasts running the nodes, which is basically how cryptocurrencies are designed. This is the other misconception. Everybody has to run a node. That's not true. The people that should be running nodes are the nerds. The guys that have the computers and they like to play with this stuff, and it's going to be a very decentralized network, and they have the fiber optic connections and all this stuff. And then you just connect to a wallet from your phone and send your transaction. So yes, there's not a limitation. And the price, that basically, because the way the Monero network scales, the price would basically stay constant in real terms. And this is largely because what happens is the way the penalty works is if you increase the size from, say, 300 bytes to 3 megabytes, it's the same penalty that goes from 3 megabytes to 30 megabytes. So a 10% increase is independent on how big the block size is. So the fees basically are inversely proportional to the block size. In fact, the minimum fee could actually go as a square if necessary. So basically, the limitation is technological. It's not in the protocol. So it comes down to bandwidth. What could happen is, and I don't know if you're familiar with Peter Rissen's paper.
A few of them, yeah.
Okay, he's one of the Bitcoin Cash guys. You could hit a point if you really saturated the thing that the orphan block probability goes up, and the miners will simply demand more than just the penalty to increase the block size. So you could see some pushback there.
Yeah.
That is actually a built-in limit. But we're dealing basically with the capability of transactionability. So this Moore's law, this Nielsen's law, Graham's law, the fact that you have this drop in technological activity. The other interesting thing that Monero did, which is quite unique, when we built our, I'm actually involved with what I do in the Monero project, aside from being on the core team, which is not actually a development position. But what I do in the Monero project is I design a lot of the algorithms for scaling and been working on that. Some of the areas that I work on. One of the things that we had to do was to accommodate, and just to give you an example, typically if you look at Visa, they have to have about 20 to 30 times the capacity in their network than their average transaction rate. And the reason for this is the 3 or 4 days in December where you get the surge in activity just due to the pre-Christmas shop.
Yeah.
Exactly. So in order, for example, on a blockchain, just to give you an example, in order to support, say, the transaction rate for retail transactions on Bitcoin Core, you would need somewhere around the size of the Bitcoin Cash block size just for those 3 days.
Yeah.
Or a bit bigger. So this is how. So when Monero does it is there's two medians, and you can ramp up to this to a 50-fold increase relatively quickly. But if you want a longer term increase, then you have to. It takes a longer time for it to go up. So it's two medians, a long term and a short term median. But it gives you that burst capability, and that's very important if you're going to do retail. Nobody else is looking at that question. How do you handle a sudden surge in transactions, which is built into just how the economy works. So, but this is the kind of issues that it gets really interesting. So it's not just, you have 200 million people using Monero. It's the question is, all of a sudden the transaction rate goes up by a factor of 15.
Yeah.
Because it's a question of shopping time.
Yeah, that's a complicated thing to figure out, I'm sure.
Yeah, so that was the kind of things that we have to build in. So this is the kind of improvement that has gone on in the network on a very substantial way.
Yeah, now when you're talking about the economic reality of not everyone running their own node during an actual mass adoption event, right? Because, as you said, only the nerds would do it, or the companies or certain wallet providers and things. Now, in such a situation, is there any kind of an issue of a compromise of privacy in that terms, where, for example, say the node operator has your view keys, and therefore
they don't need the view keys.
You're
just transmitting through their node. If you're using, there's certain types of wallets that do that, where the node operator would have the view keys, but you don't have to. But the key point there is you can also choose the node that you're going to use, or you can trust, or you can use a different one each time. So, in fact, in some ways, using somebody else's node might be advantageous using your own, because now you obfuscate where you're sending it from. So it's a distinction. You don't actually need the node operator. They just receive the transaction.
Yes. So what you could do then is you could have, let's just say, a randomized node selector in the wallet. So then, even if there's a relatively small group of nodes that most people go through, it's really hard to know who's going through which node, and therefore it's hard to actually pinpoint aggregate any transaction data for any individual user, and therefore it doesn't matter. Is that kind of what you're saying?
No, that is definitely something that can be done, yes. And so it's not a but when I refer to the nodes, it's a question of choice, I think, for a lot of people. I mean, the cost of running a Monero node, I mean, I run them. I mean, I use an old laptop that I bought for $200 surplus from the province of British Columbia like 5 years ago, and I did some customization to it, and then I hook it up to my regular home internet connection, and I can run a perfectly fine Monero node for way less than the cost of an iPad. Now, I wouldn't be able to use an iPad to do that because of all the DRM and all the lockups and all of that. So it's a choice as opposed to a cost issue. In many ways, it costs less. To get a GNU Linux running on an older laptop and that's been tuned to do that, than to get some of these highly expensive phones that are next to useless for this kind of thing. So that's why I refer to the nuts. It's people that really care about it are the ones that can end up running it.
Yeah.
Simply because that's what they're interested in.
Yeah, that makes sense. Now, sort of on that greater subject, that's one thing that I have noticed is people don't always. When you have a tool, you have to use it properly, and more importantly, there's ways you can use it catastrophically improperly. And one thing that kind of reminds me of is especially the early days of Zcash, almost basically the entire purpose behind the coin was to create a next level of privacy, to work really hard on that. And because it was an optional transaction ability, and it was not even in any mobile wallets or even any GUI wallets for a while. In fact, I do remember a friend of mine went and bought something from a shop with a shielded Zcash transaction in the early days. He got out the command line thing and did a whole computation just to do that. But again, as you're saying, nerds, right? What are some mistakes people make when using Monero that kind of harms their privacy, and what are some best practices you would recommend that they would use to get the most out of it?
Okay, the example of Zcash is essentially the failure of optional privacy, because hardly anybody uses Zcash set transactions today. And that's a problem, because then you don't get this mixing effect that you get in Monero. Everybody mixes. Your mix set is really, really small. To be honest, some of the worst things that people could do with Monero is actually the choice of device and compromising at the device level. I got this question. I remember getting the same question. I was giving a talk as part of a panel in Kiev in late 2017. And the question was phrased in terms of the Ukrainian KGB, if I remember correctly. Being the local three-letter agency that people were concerned about there.
Of course.
And my response is the same that I give you. I mean, my response to this is, look at your end devices. Are they secure? because that's the weak point. I mean, Edward Snowden said this. So are you running a Windows computer that's you got DRM all over the place, all sorts of spyware? Are you running a phone that is riddled with apps that are spying and selling everything you don't have root access to? And that's what's going to kill your privacy. Because the problem is going to be on that device. If you have spyware running on your computer, not only are you going to lose your privacy, you're going to lose your coins.
Yeah.
And in 2011, I was removing miners that stole Bitcoins from Windows computers.
Yeah, like the botnet type things.
Yeah, that's how. And so the answer to the question is the first thing you need to do is pick a secure device. In my opinion, the best you can do is a GNU Linux laptop. As to which particular distribution, that's the personal taste. Some people like things like Dale's that are optimized for price, but your Ubuntu's are perfectly fine. And practice some reasonably strong, so that OPSEC, privacy hygiene with the thing. Those are key things you can do. That's kind of the basic stuff. And that's now the minute you get into Windows, the problem with Windows is you don't know what that operating system's doing. And the way it's designed, because it's all proprietary, is a lot of the data does go to the government.
Of course.
And so you should assume so. I mean, I've had discussions with people that, for example, they'll argue they trust Facebook, but they don't trust the U.S. government.
Well, they're trusting both at the same time.
Well, that's impossible, because if you trust Facebook, you're trusting the U.S. government.
Exactly.
You can trust the U.S. government and not trust Facebook. But it doesn't way that works. Yeah. But you can't do it the other way. So these are the most basic mistakes that people make. I think it's the type of device. Anything that you can run Netflix on is compromised. Anything you can run, any kind of like watch NHL, any of that kind of protected video and things with DRM in it, that's good. That should be considered as compromised. I mean, I know we support Windows, but I mean, the fact of the matter is that even that's a risk. I wouldn't even trust Windows with my own banking, let alone with cryptocurrencies.
Yeah. I mean, I've ditched Windows a few years ago, like 4 years ago today, I think. Or not today.
2006 it was for me.
Yeah. Unfortunately, it took me a little longer to get with the program.
The Vista in the horizon. I saw the Vista in the horizon and did not like it. That was what it was. It was...
Yeah. Definitely. Anyway, I ran XP for several years after Vista came out until I was forced not to.
Yeah, what I did is I made the switch before I switched to GNU Linux in August of 2006, ahead of the Vista launch date, which was December or something like that. Yeah. I mean, I still run it, but I put it in a sandbox. So I treat it as something that's what I mentioned to you when I said, well, if you want to do Skype, I could accommodate it. Well, sure, I put it in a sandbox.
Yeah, of course.
And I'm not going to let it get into, the stuff that's sensitive.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's one reason I use Jitsi whenever I can is because,
yes.
And most people don't like. Most people love Zoom these days, and I'm not. I can't stand.
I can't stand it.
I don't like. I don't like Zoom very much.
But the reason they do it is because because it's a simple thing that everybody's using. And Jitsi, I mean, I find it's great. I love it. I mean, I use it. I tell people, it works very well, and it avoids all of these privacy issues. With things like Zoom. So it's effective and it does the job well. So that's a major thing. Yes, you can do bad OPSEC, but I mean, the biggest problem, the risk that you have is somebody's going to take your keys. And if they do that, they're not going to just steal the view key. They're going to steal the spend key and they're going to take that Monero away. Yeah.
And that kind of reminds me when you're talking about government spooks and government access, there's been a lot of noise lately about the IRS putting up bounties to crack Monero, and then there's a company, Ciphertrace, that says they can and does not say exactly how they're going to do it. But so I work in the news industry, unfortunately. And so, I see headlines come and go all the time. And, I've seen this kind of one, in some way or another. There's always some rumor of the IRS or the FBI or NSA. They think they can crack everything. And so what do you think about these kind of claims?
Okay, let me backtrack on this one again, because first thing that I like to do is try to get an understanding of what chain analysis is. And you can pick a simple coin like Bitcoin, understand what they're doing, and understand the theater, and there's both. Now, there are a couple of open source projects. One of them is called Graphene, and the other one is called BlockSci. And BlockSci is basically the basis of what these chain analysis companies do.
Yeah.
And you can download the code and you can play around with this stuff. You need a small blockchain to do it with. Basically, they build these transaction trees, and you basically need a ton of RAM. You need enough RAM to store the entire blockchain in RAM. We're talking Bitcoin, for example.
Yeah, that's a lot.
Well, in
of
Bitcoin,
RAM.
you're looking about half a terabyte, about a terabyte of RAM. I mean, you can get a super high-end motherboard today, I think, for a prosumer that would run something like that with that kind of RAM, but they typically use server clusters. So that have like a couple of terabytes of RAM to run the thing. And so then, because the databases are not optimized for doing this kind of chain analysis, they're optimized for making payments. So that's how it works. So now, if you have a lot of data points, you can then turn around and do chain analysis. A good example of the claims that someone like, say, Elliptic would make is they take an example where someone has taken, say, 50 Bitcoins or 100 Bitcoins, broken them up into 1.1 Bitcoin sizes, because that's what you need for Wasabi Wallet.
Yeah.
Split it all up, create all these massive transactions, run it through the Wasabi mixers, and then reassemble the whole thing at the back end. And then they come out what they think is quote unquote they mixed it. Well, they didn't, because once you look at the correlation points, it's a statistical analysis problem. You realize that the probability that this was recombined in the way that it happened is extremely low. So they can really provide, say a law enforcement say, well, yeah, this stuff at the end is basically the stuff at the beginning. That's where it works. Now, that doesn't make chain analysis companies a lot of money. So what they did is they built a theater around it for compliance purposes, where they claim that they can track the transactions, and half of the stuff is just hit and miss. For example, you take transactions coming out of an exchange, a VISP, and then you say, well, okay, we can show that this ended up in some sanctioned domain or something. Output on a pawn site or whatever. Well, that's like saying people withdraw money from the bank, and then 10 transactions later you have cocaine on it. Well, you know that, but the problem is who put the cocaine there? You don't have that answer. And it's the same problem with Bitcoin. So there's a lot of theater around it.
Yeah.
So now what happens when you try to do this thing on Monero? Okay, well, let's look at exactly, and I listened, there's actually a broadcast from YouTube on this, where the interview with two members of the Monero community, Saran Noether and Justin Einhofer. And they interviewed David Jensen for Ciphertrace. It was a really interesting interview. And he asked some really tough questions, and the guy evaded a lot of them, but he also provided a lot of information. And really what it comes down to is this. If you throw enough data at it, you could, in principle, get some kind of really weak signal when you have a really chopped signal in Bitcoin. But it's such an edge case. And I'll explain, for example, the scenario. One classic scenario is where you have, let's say you have a ransomware attack, and let's say 1,000 victims or pay ransomware, and they all cooperate, and they all tell the police, law enforcement, all the details of their Monero transactions that they sent to this one group, and they then coalesce the whole thing. Well, yeah, you might get some correlation out of the thing, even with the mixing. Especially if the other person doesn't really use good OPSEC, you might get something out of that, or some probability, reasonable probability out of it. But you need that 1,000 data points. If you got 2 data points, it's not going to work.
Yeah, of course.
It's called the EI attack. So I guess there is some element of truth, very small element of truth, and a lot of theater. Now the IRS gets into the picture. Now, there's one agency in the United States that can benefit from theater, the IRS. You can spend $1 million on theater, and these companies will deliver that. And all they have to do is spook a couple of people that are reasonably sized to be totally meticulous with taxes, and they got them $2 million back.
Yeah, of course.
So, the real return on that 1.2 million or something they paid these companies could be phenomenal for the IRS, because all they have to deliver is theater. And then the IRS is way ahead.
Or they can catch an extraordinarily stupid person who did some really dumb things. Like, for example, he bought a certain amount of crypto. He tweeted about how much he had, and then he went and bought a yacht for about that exact same amount, and they just kind of combine, and they're like, oh, and then they get this guy, and then everyone is scared. They're like, oh, they know all my transactions.
They don't even need the crypto tweet.
Exactly.
They don't even need to do a script. All they have to do is a postal code on it. In Canada, it's a postal code. In the US, it would be a zip code on it. If they know this person bought a yacht for $30 million and there's no clear source of income declared to raise the $30 million, they know they need to audit the guy.
Yeah.
It's not complicated. You don't even have to know anything about it. Al Capone in the 1930s was caught by the IRS. Totally cash.
Yeah.
So you don't even need a tweet.
Yeah.
They could do it. Yeah. So in reality, I think really the value is in theater in this one. If you because that's an application where I think you're going to have real trouble getting anything realistic out of it. But I do think the IRS will get their money's worth.
Yeah, it'll be worth it for them.
Yes, that will be my argument on that.
Yeah, so that brings us to the general concept of privacy for the average consumer and the privacy movement. And so, obviously, I've always cared about privacy to a certain extent. I've gotten, more into it as the years go on. But the average person had no visibility of this pre-Snowden. Like, before the whole Snowden thing, the average person did not understand that they were being spied on. They did not really care. And then I noticed that in recent times, for example, increasing, again, arbitrary metric, right? But there's been an increasing amount of people who I send a text to, who you can tell that they also use the Signal app. And it's not just people who I know are into this. It's like some random CNN reporter who came out to do a story on me was like using it. Okay, well, you understand reporters. But then even like, my girlfriend's little sister or whatever, all of a sudden is like using it. And like, oh, like this is surprising. And there seems to be a more awareness about privacy than there was in the past. But do you think this is ever going to be a mainstream concept that we have to actually secure our privacy online? Or was it always going to be a fringe thing where just there's a few hardcore people that care about it a whole lot, but most people just don't care?
I think a pendulum is going to switch, actually. And one of the reasons why, well, there's a couple of things. The first thing is most people aren't aware how much spying is actually happening. They don't realize themselves they're being spied upon. So it's one of those things, a question of awareness of the problem as much as a question of not caring. There are people who say, well, I don't care, be surveilled, and that is true. But there's some simple people who just not aware of it. And there's a technological divide that people don't understand what's going on in the technology. So people that are aware tend to be more conscious of privacy. That's a major factor. The awareness, I think, has changed a lot. It's also generational. You tend to have cycles of generations that are more conformist and others that are more radical. I mean, you can do generational analysis if you take going all the way back to the World War II generation, people will say 95 and older, all the way to Gen Alpha, 5 and younger. And you're going to find that each generation, typically, they kind of alternate in many ways. So, for example, the silent generation is sort of similar to the Gen Xers and the baby boomers and millennials. And so you get this sort of different counterflow of how different generations feel about things. So that's also a factor. But it's a question of awareness. I think people don't really understand they're being spied on. And once they start understanding it, then they suddenly start getting concerned. And then we'll also see the kind of backlash, for example, that Facebook is getting right now.
Oh, yeah.
And in particular, if you look at the backlash is getting among some very young people, it's quite interesting. I was at a meeting, and they had all sorts of generations, and I won't go specifically what group it was, but there were people of all ages, and I spoke against using Facebook. And the youngest member of the group at the end of the meeting personally thanked me for my position. So it's not what people think it is. It's a question of awareness. And I think it's a lot more awareness of privacy and a lot more distrust of companies like the abuses of companies like Amazon or Amazon Alexa. I mean, you basically have a microphone in everybody's home.
Yeah, it's like
You want that?
East Germany all over again,
But no, in Germany, the Stasi didn't have a microphone in every phone. No, that's not correct. They did not have a microphone in every house.
Yeah, now they do, though.
Yeah, so this is the distinction. But yeah, that's a good analogy. So you look at this kind of stuff, and I think the awareness of it, there's also, I think, a perception that a lot of people, well, it's just for marketing purposes, this isn't really going to be a harmful thing, or in fact, it can be used for really nefarious things. I mean, I can go into things such as even mass murder or genocide. You could use targeting based on all of these analytics for some horrible applications. So there are definitely things that the risks, I think, are not aware of. And this is the kind of thing, if you have a conversation about it, people become aware of and then they respond to it. But I think there is a backlash already.
Yeah, I definitely notice if my, what would we call it, like anecdotal metric for this is how much I see people complaining about strange targeted advertisement. Like, I thought it was just talking about that. I don't think I even typed it, and then I saw an ad for it. Like, this is weird. Like, the more I hear that kind of happen, or you write something in message, like in Facebook Messenger to someone, and then all of a sudden you start seeing advertisements for it, and then they start getting creeped out.
But do you know how the technology works? Do you know how it actually works?
Well, which part? The advertising?
The tracking advertising.
I'm sure there's a few different ways.
It's a very simple technology. It's been around for 25 years. Basically, what you have is you have tracking cookies. Now, the tracking cookie links the activity from multiple sites that you visit. If one of those sites have a login, then it's linked to the login. If you then go on a different device with the same login, then the tracking cookie follows you to the different device. That's what companies like Google and Facebook do. Facebook, for example, they got their little icons everywhere. So they're tracking you with that cookie everywhere you go. So then you type something into Facebook, unless you wipe out all the cookies, then Facebook is going to track you through all your devices that have the same logins. And they use all those icons to track you. That's how they do it. It's a simple thing to block if you know what you're doing. I mean, you basically use something like Firefox and you get rid of all the cookies in every session, and you don't open and close. So if you want to log into Google, for example, well, just create a separate session of Firefox, do your business in Google, and shut the thing down and wipe out all the cookies. And there's no tracking. So it's very easy to protect against once you know how the system works.
Yeah, but clearly most people don't. They don't have that habit of doing that.
And then they get freaked out. Why am I getting all these ads? And where are they coming from? And I'm being tracked everywhere. And you are being tracked. But that's how it works. It's not. The technology has been off. Yeah, it is. And granted, I mean, I know generationally, my generation is probably more privacy conscious. Throw in a nerdy baby boomer, and you've got probably the most anti-tracking kind of combination you can think of. But it's that's how they do it. It's not a complicated technology, and again, it's very easy to defend against.
Yeah.
And I mean, I had some fun when I was at the Chaos Computer Conference in Berlin, no, in Leipzig. Sorry, in Leipzig last winter, and my cell phone plan, the way my local carrier does it, they route everything through their server back in Vancouver. So what was happening was I was switching back and forth between connecting to a Wi-Fi in Leipzig and connecting through my phone via what they thought was in Canada. So it was driving Google nuts because 1 minute I was in Canada and 1 minute I was in Germany. And just you could see the differences, all the tracking. It was actually quite amusing to watch, just on the same session. Like I got an open session on Firefox, and I decide I go to the local Wi-Fi, and then maybe the signal isn't very good. Oh, okay, I'll just plug in my phone.
And your phone's back home.
But then all of a sudden the IP addresses changes, and it's just totally confused Google out of their mind.
Yeah, I've had some very strange advertisements through VPN use or whatever. It's just like
you will.
thought I was in Saudi Arabia for a while, and I don't know why that happened, but it's funny to see the confusion.
Tor is another one that can throw them off quite a bit if you keep switching back and forth.
Yeah. So what is next on the horizon for Monero that you're very excited about?
Well, immediately, of course, in 2 weeks, where the transaction rate size is going to drop from about 2,600 bytes to 2,000 bytes. That's interesting. And then there's down the road, Bulletproofs Plus, we have another 90 to 180 bytes drop in transaction size. So that's what's happening. That's kind of interesting stuff. I'm perfectly excited of some of the tweaks on scaling that we're going to do. They're minor, but they're significant.
Yeah.
And then you get into things like when we talk about a lot of the research that's being done in Monero is being basically how do we make transactions more efficient so we can increase the ring size. And a lot of this algebra, we're talking cutting edge research level mathematics here. So, I mean, I've seen some of the proofs and I've seen some things like Arcturus, for example. And it's going to be a few years because this has to be betted. The mathematics have to be betted before then you can do the audits and put it into the main chain and so on. So, but that's a really exciting research that's going on. Basically, smaller transactions with more ring size mixings. That's a long term. We have some long-term research that's been started even on quantum computing. That's at this point, it's a long-term risk. Don't get me wrong. I'm not the opinion thinking it's going to happen tomorrow, maybe even 20 or 30 years. But the research is already happening. How will you adapt? How will we adapt as a project? And there's actually some researchers working on that right now. The very preliminary level, I must admit. That's exciting. Another major exciting advance in the past, of course, was we are basically a really strong ASIC resistant coin. I don't know if people realize that. And that major improvement happened in 2000, fairly recently with RandomX, actually. It was and that basically means that it is a CPU coin for mining.
And permanently so?
Well, I mean, if you wanted to design a Monero ASIC, what you basically end up creating is a very green CPU. Because that is the way that RandomX works is it uses like overwhelming amount of all the functions of the CPU, so you can't really reproduce it on an ASIC without basically reproducing the whole CPU. Now, you could make a more efficient step-down CPU that would effectively be an ASIC, but then that could be used for a whole bunch of other things. So that's why I say I think a Monero ASIC will be a green CPU, if you want to think of it. But the thing is, in order to get the kind of ASIC dominance, you need like 20, 30 times, 10 times. The minute you talk 1 or 2 times, the range of CPUs is even bigger than that.
Yeah.
So I think it's going to be like for a long time. And GPUs are actually somewhere in the mid-range. So the best CPUs are better than a GPU, but the GPU still competes with the lower-end stuff. So that's kind of the scenario with mining. But that's what's very, very exciting. There's a lot of work being done also in wallets, and the multi-signature work is being done on that. There was a project for doing atomic swaps with Bitcoin, which is quite interesting. That's happening. So there's a lot of interesting little things here and there that are happening. Longer term, those are some of the major ones, I would say. But I mean, the main thrust is how do we make the transaction smaller, more efficient, and then you can increase the ring size.
Yeah.
Of course, Nielsen law, Moore's law, you can just increase the ring size with the current technology, which could also happen too. So.
Yeah. Well, it seems like, scaling is the word of the day, especially because it enables higher privacy and, for more people.
But I stick my head on this. Monero would outcompete Bitcoin on scaling without even considering privacy.
And that's because of the way the adaptive block size is
because of the adaptive block size and because of Moore's law and Nielsen's law. So scaling is the lesser known aspect of Monero that a lot of people don't realize, that we have this really powerful, because it's the only coin that does that. And the funny thing is everybody else has copied Bitcoin's maximum number of coins. It's very marketable because you sell it to a hedge fund and they love it. But it doesn't work. And nobody's shown to me that it does.
Yeah.
It's like a ticking time bomb.
Well, we'll see how that pans out, especially a lot of times, what was it, as the unfortunately, as was it John Maynard Keynes said, in the long run, we're all dead, right? So there's a lot of problems created that people don't solve because, 10, 20, 30 years, is the coin even going to be in the top 100 anymore? Is anyone going to still be using it? And so, a lot of people don't even probably address it because, that's way too far out. Kind of,
Yeah, but the thing is, if you look, for example, at the way the block rewards are falling in Bitcoin, we're not talking even 10 years. We're talking, we're now at 6.250. Then there's the next halving will be about 3 years. We're going into the threes.
Yeah.
That's equivalent to Monero's tail emission. And so in about 7 years, Bitcoin's halving is already below Monero. Maybe in 10 years, we'll be at, a quarter. So no, it's not that far down the road.
Yeah.
And that's what a lot of people don't realize. And a very interesting example was Bitcoin. Now, if you know the history of Monero, Monero was forked of Bitcoin. Bitcoin had this massive pre-mine, like 84% or something, or 83%, something like that. And in order to cook this up, what they had to do is they wanted to make it look like it was a Nina mine over 2 years, and it so-called happened in the dark web. Quite funny, but anyway. So they have the block reward fall really drastically. They abandoned the adaptive block size in 2019 because they couldn't support it any longer. The numbers, their actual block reward of Solo is about a tenth of that of Monero once you factor everything in place. So there's no incentive for them for the miners. So they went to a miner voting system where effectively the miners create a cartel and raise up the price. So back to the Bitcoin problem, because Bitcoin does not have the tail emission. So this is not that far down the road.
Well, this is very fascinating, and I'm sure a lot of people will enjoy this. Where could people find more about you or your online presence if you have a good public one? Where should I send you?
Okay, so if you want to find about me, there's a couple of places you can find me. Obviously, if you go to getmonero.org, I'm listed there. And you can contact me by email there, etc. I do participate a fair amount on Reddit. So I do hang around the Monero forums and a few of the others. So I'm in there under ArticMine. And it's without the C, by the way.
Yeah.
So anyway, so that's the places you'll find me. You won't find me on Facebook, and I'm not on Twitter.
Of course.
That's about it. I'd also hang on the IRC Monero channels a lot, so you can find me there also. That's another good place. So those are so I can be reached online, and of course I can be reached by email.
Yeah. Well, it's fantastic. Thanks so much for spending the time, and I hope you have a great rest of the day.
Well, it's been a pleasure.
Thanks.
Thank you.